Our guest today is Bill Ury. Bill's written and published several books. He's here with one of those books, which is Getting to Yes with Yourself. That follows on, as I read your press or on your site, it's almost looking at it as a prequel to Getting to Yes, which was your first book, right, which has been printed 12 million times in English and has been published in 37 languages. So we've got quite an accomplished, well-read individual with us today. Other books are The Third Side, Getting Past No, and The Power of a Positive No. But that's just like a small bit of who Bill is. And I don't know if, for those of you who I sent the link around to his page, I'll try not to bore you or try not to go on for too long, but he's the co-founder of Harvard's program on negotiation. And he's currently a distinguished senior fellow at Harvard, correct? But this is where it starts to get really, really interesting. He's worked providing mediation services in conflicts ranging from Kentucky coal mines to the Middle East and to the Balkans. He's worked with Jimmy Carter to create an organization to help avert or solve for civil wars, where he's actually traveled to Indonesia and helped to resolve a civil war, and in Venezuela to prevent a civil war. So later today, when you think you're really cool and you've closed that $20,000 upgrade for your client, think back to this and you'll put it in perspective, okay? It's still really cool, go close it, but put it in perspective. He's also won several awards or been recognized many, many times for his work. There were one or two that jumped off the page for me. He's won a Distinguished Service Medal from Russia for his work. So in addition to everything else that I've been telling you, he actually might be a spy for all we know. He has a BA from Yale. He has a PhD and a PhD from Harvard. The work that he's done for in terms of global political conflict is just part of what he does. He also works with top corporate executives in training them to learn how to be better mediators and better negotiators. And what I'm really looking forward today is hearing how you kind of marry global conflict resolution to good business practices. And after Bill speaks with us for a few minutes and presents to us, I hope we can have a wide open conversation around that. We have 15 of his, or between 15 and 20 of his most recent books here today, so after the talk, if you'd like one, please grab one. If you'd really like one and there isn't one left for you, just get in touch with me afterwards and we'll get a few more for those people who really want them, okay? So thanks for coming today. Welcome, Bill. Bill, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it. That was quite an intro. What I want to talk with you this morning is really about what I think is one of the more important, valuable, useful skills that any of us can have in today's challenging times, and that's the skill of negotiation, of getting to yes, of trying to reach agreement with others. And as I've been in this field ever since I was a graduate student up the way here at Harvard many years ago, I've had a kind of like a front seat view on something that I call a revolution that actually accompanies the knowledge revolution, the information revolution of which Google is a part, which is a more silent revolution, but it's a revolution in the way in which we as individuals or organizations or societies make decisions. Because typically a generation or two ago, the main way in which people made decisions was people on the top of the pyramids of power, gave the orders, and the people on the bottom simply followed the orders. And now, thanks to the information revolution, those pyramids of power are starting to collapse into organizational forms that more resemble networks, flatter forms, more horizontal forms. And as that shifts, the form of decision-making shifts from vertical to horizontal, and another name for horizontal decision-making is negotiation, is getting the yes. So that to get our jobs done nowadays, we're literally dependent on dozens, hundreds, thousands of individuals, organizations, over whom we exercise no direct control. If we want to get to yes with them, we have to negotiate. So let me just actually ask you, if you don't mind, a few quick questions about your own negotiating experience. Because if you think about it, what I'm interested in is, what stops us from getting to yes? So let me just ask you to think about your own experience for a moment here and ask yourself the question of, if I were to define negotiation very simply and very broadly as trying to reach agreement with someone, you have some interests which maybe you hold in common, like an ongoing relationship with a customer, and some interests which maybe are in tension with each other, like you'd like to get more money for your contract for Google, and maybe they'd like to pay you less. Who do you find yourself negotiating with in the broad sense of the term in the course of your day? Just if you wouldn't mind just calling it out. Who do you negotiate with?
Spouse.
Your spouse. Okay, we'll start with the hard ones there. Your children. Okay. Who else? Your what?
Colleagues.
Your colleagues. Okay. Who else? Your what? Internal teams, right? Anybody? What was that? CMOs. Okay. CMOs. Who else?
My teenagers.
Your teenagers. Okay. So, it's at home, it's at work. Now, if you were to kind of make a ballpark estimate of how much of your time do you spend, broadly speaking, in the course of your day, engaged in the process of back and forth communication, trying to reach agreement with your teenagers, your spouse, your colleagues, your clients, your suppliers, your boss, the internal partners, and so on, what percentage of your time do you think it would be? What fraction of the time, if you had to give it a certain percentage? What would you say? Half, yeah. How many would say? How many would say it's? How many would agree with that? It's at least half. Okay. So that's we don't always think of it formally as negotiation, but in the informal sense, we're engaged in this process from the time we get up in the morning with our spouse, teenagers, kids, and so on, to the time we go to bed at night. And so let me just ask you a couple other questions. I mean, you think about would you say, sir, maybe looking at the past, say, 5 or 10 years of your work career, would you say that the amount of time that you spend negotiating, has it stayed pretty steady? Does it go down over time as you get maybe more authority in your job? Or does it go up? What would you say? How many say it's going up? Okay, almost all of you. So that's the negotiation revolution in form. And I've traveled around the world. In every country around the world, I see this revolution taking place in the way in which we make decisions. More and more negotiation, and even in Russia, even in Russia, a little slower in Russia, but even in Russia, yeah, no, absolutely. There's the change. Well, I used to go to Russia back in the days of the Cold War, and it's even though change has been slow sometimes, it's changed a lot since those days. There's a lot more negotiation going on. In fact, getting the yes, I remember when it first came out, so there were some Russian friends who wanted to translate it into Russian, but they thought negotiation was subversive. They didn't want to teach people how to negotiate because then they would challenge authority. So, but now there are Russian editions of it. So one thing that I think might be useful just for the next, we've got this hour together here, is if you have in mind at least one challenging negotiation that you're currently facing. Something, it might be just for yourself. It might be with your teenager, or it might be with your customer, or it might be an internal negotiation with the CMO, or whoever it is. Have in mind some challenging negotiation. Okay, everyone got at least one in mind? So let me ask you a quick question then about the one you just selected. There are maybe two types of negotiations we engage in. The internal negotiations inside the organization, with our colleagues and coworkers and so on. And then there are the external negotiations, let's say with clients, for example, or suppliers. How many of you, just out of curiosity, have just selected an external situation? External. Okay? How many of you selected an internal situation? Okay. Obviously, and if just out of curiosity, if you had to say which one was harder, the negotiation inside or the negotiation outside, if you had just to make a broad generalization, which personally do you find more challenging? Internal negotiations or external? How many would say external? Okay. How many would say internal? Okay, great majority. I mean, obviously both can be challenging, but the great majority of hands go up on internal, which is interesting. That oftentimes we experience the more challenging negotiations as being the ones with the people with whom supposedly we're on the same team, working for the same mission, whatever, but those are often more challenging. Well, over the years, my passion over the years has been helping people, get to yes, individuals, organizations, societies, as Brian was mentioning, even in, war-like situations. And the thing that sort of struck me over the years is when my colleagues and I wrote Getting to Yes, the most frequent question we got for a while was, yeah, but how do you get to yes with people who don't want to get to yes? How do you deal with people who are kind of rigid and they're intransigent or they're using dirty tricks or all kinds of things? So I kind of specialized in that for a long time. And in fact, my follow-on book was a book called Getting Past No, which was negotiating with difficult people, negotiating in difficult situations. But over the years, I began to realize that, in fact, perhaps the most difficult person we have to deal with in a negotiation, in the process of getting to yes, be it with our teenagers, our spouses, our coworkers, or our clients, is not what we think it is. It's not just the difficult person on the other side of the table, as difficult as that person can be. Actually, the biggest obstacle to us getting what we want in negotiation, curiously enough, is right here. It's ourselves. It's the person on this side of the table. It's the person we look at in the mirror, because after all, what could be more internal? It feels to me like the more internal the negotiation goes, the more difficult it is. What could be more internal than ourselves? And so our biggest opponent, actually, the person who's going to give us the most trouble often, is the person we're looking at in the mirror. I think it was Teddy Roosevelt who once said, if you could kick in the pants the person who's going to give you the most trouble that day, you wouldn't sit for a month. And so to me, that obstacle can also become our biggest opportunity if we can turn our own inner opponent, as it were, into our biggest ally. And that's really the subject of this book, my newest book, which is Getting to Yes with Yourself and Other Worthy Opponents. And where it lies to me, it lies in our very understandable, very natural human tendency to react. In other words, to act without thinking. I mean, negotiation is supposed to be goal-oriented behavior. You're looking rationally to advance your objective. But oftentimes, our own emotions, for example, get in the way. As Ambrose Bierce once said, when angry, you will make the best speech you will ever regret. And it happens a lot these days. And so the first and most important negotiation starts within. And I want to talk a little bit about that, but then I don't want to go too deep into this without really drawing you out more and getting into your own situations. But just to highlight a couple of points here from this. To me, interestingly, the foundation of being able to get to yes with yourself is the ability to step back from the situation, and I like to use the metaphor of going to the balcony. It's almost like you're negotiating with the other person on a stage. Part of your mind goes to a mental or emotional balcony overlooking that stage, where you can, it's a place of calm, of perspective, of self-control, where you, above all, can keep your eyes on the prize. For example, these days, there's so much going on in our lives. We get texts, we get emails, we get calls. There's so much information flooding in all the time. And let's just, imagine you get an email, an internal message from your organization, and you've been left out of an important decision. You kind of feel irritated, you feel frustrated, you feel pissed. So it's very tempting to just kind of compose a reply, right? And then you get the satisfaction of hitting the reply button, but you don't just hit the reply button, you hit the reply all button, and then it goes to the entire organization. And there's a button on that screen sometimes, or at least it used to be, which is the Save as Draft button. That's the button that very rarely gets used. And you kind of compose it, you get it out of your system, you hit Save as Draft. That's the balcony button. Then you do whatever everyone has their favorite techniques for going to the balcony. It might be, go for a workout, go have a cup of coffee with a friend, whatever. Take a night to sleep on it. Just take a few minutes by yourself. Whatever your technique is for going to that balcony, you're going to come back, look at that message, that email, and you're going to say, wait a minute, is this really going to advance my interest in this situation? And you're going to hit the delete button, and then you're either going to pick up the phone and call the person, or even better, get together with them if you could do that. Because it's just, when you're going to resolve a difference like that, it's much easier to do that with more ability to communicate with a voice, for example, than it is through an email. Emails lend themselves very much to miscommunication. They're great for information transfer, but not so good for handling delicate or possibly emotionally sensitive issues. So that's kind of going to the balcony. You know, if I think about my own personal experience, Brian was asking me to tell a story too about my own personal experience. You know, some years ago, I was involved as a third party in the country of Venezuela. And it was at a time when Venezuela, there were like 1 million people on the streets calling for the downfall of the president, who was then Hugo Chavez. And about 1 million people on the streets wanting to support him, and international observers were worried that it might turn into a civil war. And I'd been asked by President Carter to go down and meet with both parties and talk to them. And anyway, I had a number of meetings with both sides. I want to talk about one particular meeting I had with President Chavez. He liked to meet at night, so you know, we had made a meeting at the presidential palace at 9 p.m. He was a little bit late, 10 p.m., 11 p.m. Finally, at midnight, I'm ushered in to see the president, expecting to find him all alone. Instead, I find him surrounded by his entire cabinet, and he kind of pulls up a seat, says, here, Bill, have a seat here, and tell me, what do you think of the situation? What's your impression? And how are we doing? And I said, you know, Mr. President, I've been talking to some of your ministers here. I've been talking to the opposition, and it seems to me making some progress. He said, what do you mean progress? Are you blind? Are you naive? What are you, foolish? You're not seeing the dirty tricks the other side, those traitors on the other side are up to? He proceeded to get furious, and he leaned in very close to my face and proceeded to yell at me for, I'd say, approximately 30 minutes. Now, you know, you put yourself in my shoes for a moment. I'm thinking, well, hey, that's not true. We're not foolish. He's not seeing this. You know, I'm wanting to defend myself, but I was able to go to the balcony for a moment. And actually, one little technique that helped me go to the balcony was a friend of mine, I don't know, a few months earlier, had said, you know, Bill, if you're ever in a tough situation, he said, pinch the palm of your hand. And I said, None, why would I pinch the palm of my hand? And he said, well, because that'll keep you alert. Maybe it'll keep you a little more alert. So at that moment, for whatever reason, I remembered to pinch the palm of my hand. And you know, because at that mind, just in terms of thinking about it, I was thinking, wow, 2 years of work all down the drain. You know, you go through all these things. I'm sure if you're tough, you know, customer calls, sometimes you can literally, you know, you think you might be losing that important customer and so on. So it's, so at that moment, so I just was able to go to the balcony, not react, because if I had reacted, I mean, President Chavez was famous for giving 8-hour speeches. I mean, that, you know, the conversation could go way off the rails, and that might have been the end. But by not reacting, by going to the balcony, by listening instead, you know, I was able to listen, just kind of clear my mind, because, you know, I was able to observe myself from the balcony, just note the thoughts and feelings that are going through me, just, you know, okay, that's fine. Now let me pay attention to President Chavez, and just give attention to him and try and figure out what was going on for him. I mean, why was he yelling at me? What was going on? Was this some kind of show for the cabinet and so on? What was irritating him so much? And sure enough, by just listening to him, you know, he began, you know, he could have gone on forever, but since I wasn't reacting, you know, after about a half an hour, he started to run a little bit out of steam. Even he did. And then I saw, if you just watch body language, I saw his shoulders sink a little bit, and in a very kind of weary tone of voice, he said to me, so Yuri, what should I do? That is the sound of a human mind opening. Before that, if someone's angry with you, you know, like it's your spouse, your teenager, or whatever, it's very hard to use reason with someone who's in a highly emotional state of mind. It's like beating your head against a stone wall. But, you know, by listening, he kind of he kind of went into a different emotional phase of kind of like, okay, so what should I do? And I said, you know, Mr. President, this is December. You know, Christmas is coming up. Last Christmas, all the festivities around the country were canceled. No one had any fun because of this conflict. why don't just declare a truce? Give everyone a chance to go to the balcony for a few weeks, enjoy the family with their holidays, and maybe when they come back in January, everyone will be in a better mood to kind of listen and see if we can make some progress. He said, oh, that's a great idea. I'm going to propose that in my next speech. And then his mood had completely shifted. He said, and over Christmas, I think I'd like you to come with me and actually see around the country, and you come with me. And then he said, for a moment, he said, wait, if you're always with me, maybe you won't be seen as a neutral anymore. But he said, that's no problem. I'll give you a disguise. Complete shift. How? Because I had been able to get to yes, in a sense, with myself, my own restrain my own, natural reaction to defend myself or to get into an, would have gotten no use to get into an argument with the president of Venezuela. I was able to go to the balcony, and then I was able to kind of shift that situation. Just one example. Let me ask you, just if I may, what techniques you use to go to the balcony in your very busy, hectic lives, either work or personal? What do you do to go to the balcony? Anybody? You sleep on it, okay? Go for a walk.
Fresh air.
Fresh air, yeah. Anything else?
I definitely draft emails but save them.
You draft emails and then save them, right? Save as draft, okay.
Talk to a colleague.
Talk to a colleague, yeah. Someone else can be your balcony. Okay, good. Let me, if I may, just give you one more story. And then I really want to, I want to see what's on your minds and open it up to conversation here and see what kind of questions you've got. But this conversation that I met with President Chavez was, about 10, 12 years ago. But a more recent one that I got involved in, which was a business conversation, was about a year and a half ago. The wife and daughter of a very prominent Brazilian entrepreneur got in touch with me. He was the founder of Latin America's largest retailer, really, and built up this business from nothing. He was a billionaire, and he had sold half of his company to a French, also billionaire, president of a very large French conglomerate. And they'd worked together for some years, and then they'd had a falling out, and so they were fighting over control. And Abilio was the name of the person I went to see, and he was like 76 at the time. He was going to be chairman of the board for another 8 years. 2.5 years of just sheer battle. I mean, every lawyer you could imagine. I mean, dozens and dozens and dozens of lawyers, arbitration suits. It was all over the papers. I think the Financial Times called it perhaps the biggest cross-continental boardroom showdown in recent history. I mean, it was not just affecting the immediate parties, but their families, 150,000 employees of the company. It was even straining Brazil-French commercial relations. Anyway, so I sat down with Abilio. I didn't know if I could help, but I sat down with him in his living room there in São Paulo, and I asked him to tell me his story, and he told me the story, and then I said, then I realized, there's always this negotiation with the other side, and that's extremely difficult. But as I was saying, sometimes even more difficult is the negotiation inside ourselves. And what I could sense inside Abilio was he wasn't sure whether he wanted just to continue to fight. He was a fighter naturally. Let's fight and fight. Or did he really want to reach an agreement? And sometimes, we're also torn in a lot of these situations. What is it we want to do? So I asked him, Abilio, what do you want? How can I help you? What do you really want here? And he had a ready answer to that. He said, okay, I want the stock at a certain price. I want elimination of the non-compete clause. I want company real estate. And he had named 5 or 6 other things. He gave me a laundry list of what he wanted. He was clear about what he wanted. But to me, that's just the beginning of because oftentimes we think we know what we want, but we don't know what we really want. So I asked him, but Abilio, you're a man who's got everything. You've got your own private plane. You can fly everywhere around the world. You got your new family. You got everything. Is this really what you want to do with your life? Is get involved in big dispute? I mean, what do you really want? What do you most want in your life right now? Anyway, he kind of struggled with that question for a while, but then after a bit, he finally said to me, you know what I want? I want my freedom. Freedom, that's what I want. And I said, so what does freedom mean to you? He says, well, it's freedom to pursue my business dreams, my business deals, and so on, and I want free to spend time with my family. So once we'd gotten down to that level, you know, and oftentimes that's what we need to do inside of ourselves, ask ourselves, what is it truly that's important to us? What's the prize? From the balcony, that's what we do. Then it turned out, once it was clear, you know, then I could ask a follow-on question. I could ask a Bilioli kind of question like, okay, so you really want your freedom. Who can give you that freedom? Who can give you that sense of freedom, the thing you most want in the world? Who can give that to you? Is it your adversary, you know, the former business partner? Is that the only person who can give you your freedom? You're total hostage to him? Or at least to some extent, can you yourself give yourself that sense of freedom? And that kind of like opened up a possibility. He said, okay, yeah, well, maybe I can give myself that freedom. So there was this kind of a psychological antecedent there inside himself. He said, well, I could go ahead and pursue business deals regardless of what this other guy's doing. I can go spend time with my family on a holiday. And he proceeded to do those things. And paradoxically, by doing that, he was psychologically less dependent on the other side. And it actually made it easier for me then when it came to trying to find a resolution with the other side. And as it turned out, this huge, colossal, titanic struggle that all these lawyers were in, I met with the other side in Paris on a Monday in a restaurant there. And the representative of the other side said, so why are you here? And I said, you know, because life's too short. Life's too short for these kinds of like lose-lose struggles, because that's what often happens in battles is, you know, each side's trying to win. It's a win-lose struggle, but in the end what happens is everyone ends up losing. And you know, it's affecting everyone. So he said, so how would you settle this? What's your proposal? And I said, well, if we can just agree on 2 principles, I think maybe we can make some progress. He said, what are those? I said, freedom for each individual. Let them go on with their lives. We'll figure out a way to free them from this struggle. And dignity. You know, because everyone wants respect. He said, so what would that mean? And he called me back in his office the next day, and you know, we looked at it, and like on one piece of paper, we set down what would be some terms that would tangibly reflect freedom for each individual and dignity. That was on a Tuesday. By Friday, we had both men in a law office in Sao Paulo signing the contract, resolving the whole dispute, joint press conference. They went then made a talk to all the employees of the company together, wished each other well in the future, and it was all over. And that night, actually, there was a dinner held by my client for, I think there were about 40 lawyers who just arrived in Sao Paulo for an arbitration lawsuit, and just from all over the world, from New York, from Paris, from the Middle East, or whatever, the best lawyers in the world, and you know, they were out of a job, as it were. So I'm just giving you as an example that here again, seemed like a very complicated dispute, but it really starts within us often. And so this new book of mine is about how do we get to yes with ourselves in order that we can get to yes with others. It's almost as if I've realized that we've been negotiating, you know, these days we need all the tools we can get in negotiation. And it's almost like we've been negotiating with one arm tied behind our back, because we've just been focused on outer influence. How do we influence the other side? And we've neglected sometimes our ability to influence ourselves, who after all is our best instrument for influencing others. And so we can negotiate with both arms together. So that's the essence of this book. But at this point, what I'd love to do is just see what's on your minds in terms of negotiation. Any questions, any kinds of subjects, any kinds of things that are giving you difficulty. Think back to your own situation, what makes them difficult. Whether it's customers, whether it's teenagers, or whether you want to talk about world politics, anything. Yes, ma'am.
So you mentioned in each of these cases that there's a group of people around these individuals. So I guess my question is, what do you do when you have a toxic person, or in arbitration, you've got the lawyers that are toxic, if it's cabinet members? How do you get them, how often do you see them influencing what's riling up both sides, right? So if you're going into it and you've got a person, you get them alone, you get them talking, and then you get to this resolution, but when you've got these other people sort of in their ear, how often do you need to influence them, and what have you had any of those situations?
The question was, what do you do about toxic individuals who may not be at the table, but are kind of poisoning the well, right? So one thing to think about in negotiation is that there's, what I like to think about is there's not just one table in the negotiation to focus on. In other words, you and the client, or you and the internal colleague or whatever. Always keep in mind that there are three tables in the negotiation. There's the table where you and the other side are talking, but there's the internal tables on each side. The people you have to go back to and report to an agreement about, it might be your boss, your colleagues, whoever, your family, and the people they need. And essentially that toxic individual you're talking about is often sitting at that internal table. As a spoiler, they're kind of trying to block it. And that's not uncommon in any negotiation. Oftentimes, the real problems in negotiations aren't at the kind of the external table, it's at the two internal tables. It's those two internal negotiations where you need to pay attention to just as much as at what we think of as a negotiation with the other side. And so how do you disarm that toxic person? One is first of all, you can try and find ways to talk to them, find out what their real concern is, what are they really concerned about, see if you can and deal with that. If you can't do that, then you've got to think about how do you build a kind of a winning coalition inside the other team that they neutralize that person. And you want to, but it's not uncommon at all. I mean, right now, for example, well, my very first actually negotiation, because when I was just starting off in this field, I realized it's not just in the books. You need to get out there in real world. So I got a job working at a coal mine in Kentucky, as Brian mentioned, and this was a situation where there were the workforce was going out on strike all the time, what were called wildcat strikes in contravention of the contract, and tensions had gotten really high, and there was a lot of anger. And when we got down, my colleague and I got down there, and management and the union would not even sit in the same room together. That's how bad things were. So we just shuttled back and forth for about 6 weeks until we had some proposals on the table that both sides were interested in. They came together and they reached an agreement. And there was maybe 10 people representing labor and maybe 10 people representing management, and we had a whole big kind of powwow. It was like a peace agreement, and everyone was happy except for one little critical detail, which is it had to be ratified by the workforce. It had to be a vote. And a week later, the vote took place, almost unanimous, in rejecting the very agreement that their leaders had just negotiated. Why they rejected it is partly because of what you're saying, because there were some toxic individuals who were saying, hey, don't trust management, don't trust anything that they do. Even though the agreement on the surface and in reality was much better for the union than their existing agreement, they thought there must be a trick if management's signing up to it. So then we had to go back to square one and trying to address it and deal with that toxicity, deal with that skepticism, and go back to square one. So it was an everlasting lesson for me of dealing with those situations. Please.
This is maybe slightly tangential, but I think a lot of people are probably thinking about it here. You may know that Google has a kind of a long relationship with Stuart Diamond, who comes and teaches these courses that are always sold out all over the place. And I've taken one of his courses. I'm sure you'd want to remain on the balcony and talking about somebody else who's in the same field. But I'm wondering, his approach partly to me seems to come out of the sort of more of the Stephen Covey type, more formulaic 7 steps to this and that. I mean, he distills his formula onto a business card, which he hands out at the end of the course. His slogan is getting more. I guess getting to yes was not enough for a business guy. Always got to get more. Anyway, I'm wondering if you would have any comments on that kind of an approach that he lays out. As I say, I think a lot of people here have taken it, are pretty familiar with it, how that kind of contrasts with your interests. This whole negotiation field, of course, is very rich and has so many roots in game theory and all kinds of other things. And I'm just singling this one out because it's probably the one that people at Google are most familiar with. So I'm wondering if you'd maybe have any contrasts or comparisons to your own approach there.
Yeah, I'm not. I wish I actually was more familiar with his work, but I am familiar, you know, like Stephen Covey's work and so on. Stephen Covey was a friend of mine, Covey actually, his approach was very much congruent with what we're talking about. It's based, you know, he very much believed in, you know, what's called win-win, which is, you know, when Getting to Yes first came out, the books on the kind of the best-selling books about negotiation were things had titles like Winning by Intimidation and Looking Out for Number One. I don't know if you remember those, but you know, Getting Yes proposed that, you know, yes, you want to meet, you know, satisfy your interests. The purpose of negotiation is to satisfy your interests, but we're in ongoing relationships, just as you were mentioning with game theory. You know, if you're just playing, you know, the prisoner's dilemma and you know, game theory at you know, just one round, you know, it may be in your interest to just, you know, to defect rather than cooperate. But in any kind of ongoing relationship, be it inside the organization or be it, you know, a long-standing relationship with clients or suppliers or whatever, it makes sense to cooperate. It makes sense to cooperate. And so, yes, you want to get more for yourself, but one of the best ways of getting more for yourself is actually to expand the pie, to be creative and expand the pie so there's more for you and more for the customer so that there's more for both. What Getting to Yes proposes is that kind of is that kind of approach where essentially you look behind positions for what are the underlying needs, what are the underlying interests, your interests, and the other side's interests. You try to invent options for mutual gain. You try to expand the pie. And where there are, you know, serious differences, you make use a lot of what are objective criteria to decide, you know, what's a fair way to divide up the pie. So, for example, let me just, if you wouldn't mind, let's do a 2-minute little negotiation challenge here. If you wouldn't mind, just pick a partner, person sitting right next to you, and let's do a negotiation by email. It'll take 30 seconds. Okay, everyone pick a partner. And just decide who's going to send the email and who's going to receive the email. Okay? So here's the situation. Let's imagine you two are department heads in the same organization. Let's say maybe it's Google or whatever, but you're not co-located. One of you is here in Cambridge, one of you is there in Mountain View, wherever. And you have a common boss. And this year, the idea has been we got to cut costs. And so let's say by the end of the year, your common boss comes to both of you and says, look, you know, you guys have done a great job. Everyone's done a great job cutting costs, and I've got a little extra money left in the budget. I don't know, what would be a little bit significant? Would it be like $500,000 or $100,000? What would it be? Give me a number. 500,000. Okay, 500,000 left in the budget, and he says, "I don't know how to divide it between your two different departments. You guys decide." So here are the rules. Okay, this is done. This is silent. Silence done by email, so there's no talking. It's just very simple. The sender, you just take out a piece of paper, or if you don't have a piece of paper, it's fine too. But just come up with two numbers, adding up to 500. For your proposal for how to divide up the $500,000. Now, it's not so simple to just say 250 for each, because all your people, that internal table we were talking about, are saying, hey, we need all 500,000, you know, for sales department or whatever it is. We deserve it all. You know, that other team, they don't deserve it. So you're under a lot of pressure from your team to come back with as close to 500 as possible. So you could put down on your, as if you were emailing, you know, 500 for my department, 0 for yours. You could put down 475 for my department, 25 for yours. 450 for my department and 50 for yours. There's no creativity, it's just 2 numbers here. That's all you do, it just takes 10 seconds, that's your proposal. Then those of you who receive that number, or those 2 numbers, you have one decision to make. Very simple, yes or no. Either you accept it or you reject it. That's it. There's no follow-on negotiation. So if you say yes, you're going to get whatever the other side's proposing. You're going to get the 25, you're going to get the 50,000, you're going to get whatever, the 100,000. If, however, you say no, neither department gets 1 penny. Because after the boss has said, look, if you 2 can't reach agreement, that's okay, I can find another use for the money. So it's very simple, just 2 sequential decisions. First person just picks 2 numbers that add up to 500, the second person says yes or no, and then we see the results, okay? Takes 30 seconds. No follow-on negotiation and no talking unless you just have to give me the proposal. Everyone had a chance to go through the exercise? Okay, so it's just 2 sequential decisions. 2 numbers, and then yes or no. So I'm curious, how many of you, have you all had a chance to do it? Yeah. How many of you, by curious, said yes, accepted the proposal you were offered? Okay. How many of you said no, rejected the proposal you were offered? Okay, a few of you. So I'm kind of curious, we're curious about why other people reject our proposals, so let's just see if we can learn something here. So Brian, you rejected the proposal given to you by Jonathan, right?
Yes.
What proposal did he make?
375, 125.
375, 125. So 375 for him, 125 for your department, right? And why did you reject it?
125 was close enough to 0 for me that I would.
125, okay. So you have a very, okay, so that's 1. How about, there were some others who rejected. What else? Yeah, you sir, you rejected what?
350 to 150.
350 to 150, and you rejected 1? Fairness, fairness. Now see, this is really interesting because you have economically rational decision makers who are being offered a decision between 125,000 and 0, or 150,000 and 0. And what are they picking? 0. Why? Because, as you heard, perceived fairness plays a very important role in negotiation. That it's either people will walk away from proposals, and we're going to be startled because, after all, rationally speaking, it's in their interest to accept. How many of you, for example, accepted a proposal that was less than 250,000? How many of you accepted? Okay, and when you accepted that, how many of you thought to yourself, okay, I'm going to accept this, but I'm going to remember this? Right. So, so that's often happens. How many of you, despite what I said, went ahead and just proposed 250, 250, 50-50 split? Anybody? You did. And why'd you do that?
In the spirit of what you're talking about earlier in terms of freedom,
Yeah.
is the fastest way to have both parties.
It was fast way to have both parties agree, right? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So
I would have proposed,
you would have proposed. What was that?
actually Bob didn't propose, but I would have proposed to give him 260 so that next year you have no excuse for.
There you go. Okay. It's interesting.
This year it looks like you have to give even more than I do, but next year there's going to be
He would have proposed 260. He said just for the next, to build a little cultivated goodwill. I asked this question.
It's nastier than that. It's not goodwill.
Oh, what is it?
It's the great expectation leverage, I think.
Leverage. Okay. Okay. Well, it's interesting because I once ran this exercise in, I think it was in Japan. Just asked, that question, and there was a large number of people who adopted that strategy. But when I asked them why, because they in East Asia, they tend to believe in long-term relationship. They were investing in the long-term relationship. So for $10,000 extra, they were investing more in the relationship. So there are a lot of ways to approach this. But the thing is that since perceived fairness plays an enormously important role, if the other side thinks you're just trying to win at their expense, A, they're going to remember it, So, or they sometimes may refuse to deal. And as you just saw, they'll just walk away. They'll accept zero, like Brian did. And so the question is, how do you psychologically, how can you create a situation in the negotiation that each side feels like they got at least a fair shake? And it's not just about the person across the table, because as the question came from before about the toxic people, whoever you deal with has to go back to their constituency, to their people. In this particular case, you have to go back to your department. If you can say, they say, how come you agreed to 100,000? That's they're screwing us. And so people need to have a logic, and that's why objective criteria, I didn't give you any information, but it's like, which is the larger department, which department could cut costs more, which department could use, could use the money better, and so on. Some logical thing so that each side, there's some narrative there that each side can use to say, okay, we both deferred to what's fair. And so it's just, again, something to think about in negotiation, is the psychology of fairness, because it makes a very important, it may seem small, but it actually makes a really important difference, particularly in long-term relationships. And this may be also one reason why, why is it that we experience internal negotiations as more difficult than external? It's partly because we don't, there's more emotion involved, there's more ongoing relationship, there's a lot more sometimes there's often a lot more avoidance behavior inside. We don't want to deal with difficult conflicts because we're afraid of long-term impact. Everyone's got their little black book out. So again, things to think about. I know there were some other questions there, so yeah, please.
I realize we could spend another hour talking about what I'm about to ask, so say as little as you want to, but I'm curious for your take on the situation in Washington.
Yeah.
And the inability, it seems, for the two sides to work together. I just would love your take on what maybe is sort of causing that, or how they could make their negotiations better. And I actually, in light of your book, I wondered if maybe the Republican Party now feels a little bit better with themselves, now having majorities in both houses, and maybe that helps the negotiation process. I don't know.
Sure. There's been this stalemate in Washington. I mean, it seems like both parties have been busy getting to no rather than getting to yes for the last 6 years, and certainly it's challenging even for the next 2 years. But to me, it's a classic example of the logic of each side trying to win. And the end is there's stalemate. Both sides end up losing. And actually, in these situations, it's lose, 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 because the American people, our country, loses our ability to work together to build, a country with good infrastructure, with decent pay for people, with opportunity for everyone. That's suffered a lot in this process, as well as our ability to work together to solve global problems, be it climate change or anything. And so we've paid a huge cost for it. Essentially, they've been playing a game of an eye for an eye, and we all go blind. And so, how do you change that? It's partly process, like things we're talking about. It's also partly systemic. I had the opportunity a number of years ago to be a facilitator at what was billed as a bipartisan congressional retreat. It's held in Hershey, Pennsylvania. There were about 200 members of Congress, about 100 Republicans, 100 Democrats with their spouses, and so on. And it was interesting to me that when you actually got people together, first of all, we asked them, questions. We broke into small groups. Let's say we had maybe 4, each group for conversation. We had 4 congressmen from each side, about 8. But ask them, what's this like? Why'd you go into politics in the first place? And what's the toll of this kind of conflict? And it was interesting, particularly hearing from them and their spouses, of just how unpleasant and how contrary to whatever they'd hoped to do, because you spend a lot of time trying to get into Congress and then you can do nothing basically. It's frustrating, and it was interesting. A lot of them said to me that they had spent more time visiting with people across the aisle on the train ride from DC, because we were all in one train that got hired up to Hershey, Pennsylvania, than they had in the previous 4 years. So to me, it's partly about breaking down those walls. But once they got talking with each other, I could really see there was real potential. One of the problems is that in the old days, or what seems like the old days, when there was more kind of collaboration, cooperation, it was partly because there were a lot of informal relationships that existed. Partly because people used to live more in Washington. Now they live more in their own districts, and they fly back every Friday night. And when they used to live in Washington, they used to be, their kids went to the same schools, the Little League or whatever it was. They got together, and so that one thing I've found is that informal time, where you can have cross-cutting relationships that aren't just that you're a Democrat and that you're a Republican, can kind of humanize the situation, because right now it's descended into a lot of blaming, a lot of finger pointing, and this is where it goes back to getting to yes with yourself, which is more about taking responsibility for yourself and for your I'd love to see people say like two spouses, you can blame each other, or you can say, look, I'm responsible. I'm 100% responsible for our relationship. And the other person's 100% responsible for the relationship. So the Democrats are 100% responsible for instead of just saying, oh, it's all the Republicans' fault. Or the Republicans are 100% responsible for what's going on, and just a different modality. And it may seem hard, but I've seen many examples of bipartisan cooperation, starting with Ted Kennedy here. I mean, for example, he was a classic, liberal battler, but he also knew how to build bridges. He always worked with Republicans. It's been done before; it can be done again. And I'm hoping, back to your question, that now, because of what you said, the Republicans, now that they control both houses of Congress, they're under a little pressure to deliver. Because they got to deliver. They're not just the minority party anymore. So they've got to deliver, and they want to deliver. And President Obama also, he wants to deliver too. He's got 2 years left to, accomplish his legacy. And so I'd say there's an incentive now, if they can learn to, these methods of getting to yes, which is instead of attacking each other, attack the problem together. Sit down, try and figure out what the incentives are. That little exercise we just did about perceived injustice, there's a lot of that going on. When I talk to Democrats and Republicans, they think, oh, they stung us there, we're going to sting them back. That kind of gotcha game. Everyone's got their black books. We got to learn to get beyond that.
It was great, Bill. Thanks so much for coming.
That was my pleasure, Craig.
Yeah,
Great.
really great.
Yeah, my pleasure. Great.